Adriana Smith was about 9 weeks pregnant when doctors declared her brain dead.
But Smith's family says doctors at Emory University Hospital have been keeping her on life support for more than 90 days because she's pregnant, citing Georgia's restrictive abortion law.
Smith's family spoke to TV station 11 Alive.
And I'm not saying that we would have chose to terminate her pregnancy. What I'm saying is we should have had a choice.
The case is raising complicated legal questions about abortion laws in Georgia and other states.
You have the Attorney General saying, no problem, go ahead, and you're having doctors and their lawyers reading the law and saying, we're not so sure.
On today's show, we'll take a closer look at the case and its possible implications.
Plus, a former Atlanta mayor says she's running for governor.
Georgians want and need a fighter, and I want to be the governor of Georgia to fight on behalf of Georgians.
And why some Republicans want to eliminate the state income tax. I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In from WABE. Sam, tell me more about this case that's getting national attention.
Adriana Smith was about 9 weeks pregnant in February when doctors declared her brain dead. The 30-year-old nurse and mom had suffered a medical emergency, but Smith's family says doctors at Emory University Hospital have been keeping her organs functioning until the fetus can be delivered, and they're citing Georgia law banning most abortions after roughly 6 weeks. Smith's mother, April Newkirk, spoke to TV station 11 Alive, WXIA.
My grandson may be blind, may not be able to walk. We don't know if he'll live once she has him. And I'm not saying that we would have chose to terminate her pregnancy. What I'm saying is we should have had a choice.
So you hear Smith's mother there saying the family's ability to make the choice has been taken away.
So is it clear that Georgia's abortion law would prevent Smith from being taken off life support?
Well, after this case became public, Democratic State Senator Nabila Islam Parks wrote to Georgia Republican Attorney General Chris Carr asking for clarity.
Medical professionals and hospitals are struggling to interpret this poorly written law that has a lot of gray area.
The law known as the Life Act was narrowly passed and signed into law by Governor Brian Kemp back in 2019, but it was not in force until the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022. A legal challenge to Georgia's abortion law is still working its way through the courts. The Attorney General's office responded to the state senator's letter saying there is nothing in Georgia's abortion law that requires a woman be kept on life support after brain death. That would be because removing life support is not an action done for the purpose of terminating a pregnancy. Now, Emory Healthcare seems to have come to a different conclusion. The hospital hasn't addressed Carr's legal opinion, but did release a statement last week saying treatment decisions are based on, quote, consensus from clinical experts, medical literature, and legal guidance in compliance with Georgia's abortion laws and all other applicable laws.
So why this disconnect between what the Attorney General is saying and what the hospital is saying?
I put that question to University of California, Davis law professor Mary Ziegler. And to put it in context, she pointed to two Georgia women whose deaths drew national attention last year when ProPublica reported that a state panel had ruled their deaths preventable and likely the result of doctors being slow or unwilling to provide abortion care due to Georgia's restrictive abortion law. Ziegler says medical providers in states with these laws have become a lot more risk averse. Running afoul of the law can carry criminal penalties.
The scenario in Georgia right now is an example of that, where you have the Attorney General saying, no problem, go ahead, and you're having doctors and their lawyers reading the law and saying, we're not so sure.
Ziegler says one reason Emory may have been not so sure in this case is because of a provision in Georgia's abortion law known as fetal personhood.
I haven't heard those words in a while. Sam, explain what that means.
Fetal personhood is the idea that embryos and fetuses are people and have legal rights. In Georgia, for example, people can claim a fetus as a dependent on state taxes. Ziegler told me establishing fetal personhood has long been a goal of the anti-abortion movement. And now that Roe versus Wade has been struck down, some of these personhood laws are being enforced, and that has consequences, intended and unintended, like with this Georgia case, and potentially in other areas like in vitro fertilization, contraception, or even the census. Ziegler called it basically a Pandora's box. And as these cases result in legal challenges, that could ultimately bring this issue of fetal personhood in front of the U.S. Supreme Court.
You know, all of this is so interesting because it kind of illustrates some of the complicated dynamics within the Republican Party.
Yeah, that's right. You know, on one hand, you've got Attorney General Chris Carr, who's running for governor, and he's saying, no, the law should not be interpreted in this way. And you have Republicans in the state legislature who joined with Democrats just this past session to codify protections for IVF after the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that embryos created by IVF should be considered children, potentially throwing the practice into jeopardy. Again, this is rooted in that concept of personhood, which has been a key aim of the anti-abortion movement. And here in Georgia, we heard last week from Republican Senator Ed Setzler, who sponsored Georgia's 2019 abortion law at the center of all of this. And he told the AP in a statement that he thinks Emory is acting appropriately in this case, saying, quote, "It is completely appropriate that the hospital do what they can to save the life of the child." Now, Setzler didn't respond to a request for an interview from WABE this week, but Rahul, kind of taking all of this together, it really does illustrate this complicated debate that is happening in regards to Georgia's abortion law, and also, you know, within the Republican Party on issues like IVF and personhood.
All right, let's take a break here. This is Plugged In from WABE.
Welcome back to Plugged In from WABE.
Sam, we've had another big name jump into the 2026 race for Georgia governor.
It's former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. And Rahul, you had a chance to talk with her this week as she launched her bid.
That's right. It's not a surprise. Bottoms had already said she was going to run, but Tuesday she formally launched her campaign.
We are facing chaos and uncertainty and anxiety based on the policies that are coming out of Washington. Georgians want and need a fighter.
So when it comes to Washington and President Donald Trump, Bottoms points out that 3 of her years as mayor were during Trump's first term. She served 1 term as mayor and touts her ability to work with Republican state leaders.
Okay, but didn't she have a kind of a poor relationship with Governor Kemp when she was mayor?
Yes, the two fought over COVID-19 policy like mask mandates, and she also had battles with then state senator, now Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, as they fought over state legislative attempts to take over control of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. I asked her about those.
Sometimes we have political differences, and those are the things that often make headlines. But in the way that we've been able to deliver economically with working alongside leaders in the state, I think that's a great example.
She specifically mentioned Kemp along with former Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan and late House Speaker David Ralston. I also asked Bottoms about how would a Democratic governor get things done if the legislature remains in Republican hands?
You try and find common ground and you try and put party differences aside. But also the governor is a very powerful position in the state, and there's the power of the pen. And you have to remember, even with the legislature, there's not as big of a divide as it used to be, even in making sure that seats are turned over in the legislature.
Bottoms says one of her top priorities would be expanding Medicaid in Georgia, something that's not happened under Governor Kemp. She decided not to run for re-election in 2021, and since leaving the mayor's office, she's done various jobs, including as a senior advisor to the president during the Biden administration.
I think a big question many voters will have is why Bottoms wants to be governor if she did not want to continue being mayor. It was a difficult time for mayors, of course, with the pandemic and the racial justice protests. But This is a fraught time as well.
Look, in a Democratic primary and in a possible general election, she's going to have to answer questions about how she handled the COVID pandemic, how she handled the response to the protests in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, and how those turned chaotic here in Atlanta. Also, questions about how her time as mayor ended as well, and also how she handled the Buckhead cityhood movement, which was an attempt for a richer part of Atlanta to break away from the city. Eventually, her successor, Andre Dickens, was able to stop that. I should mention that Bottoms joins Democratic State Senator Jason Estevez in the race, and over on the Republican side, Attorney General Chris Carr has already launched his bid for governor, and we expect that Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones will get into the race later this year. Speaking of Lieutenant Governor, I do want to mention another candidate who's jumped into a statewide race. Republican State Senate Majority Leader Steve Gooch is running for Lieutenant Governor. He's a Republican from Dahlonega. That's in North Georgia. He's pitching himself as a diehard MAGA supporter of President Donald Trump. He's also been known for his work around expanding rural broadband. I wanted to note something interesting in his campaign announcement. This is something that I've been following. He's supporting abolishing the state income tax.
Okay, I know you've been really fascinated by this policy idea and have done a bit of a deep dive on the potential of eliminating the state income tax. Tell me more.
Yeah, so the question I'm going to have for Gooch, along with any other candidate who's running on this idea, is how are you going to make this happen? And specifically when it comes to the state budget.
Yeah, I mean, how do you fund a state government without any income tax?
Sam, you know I love talking about this and talking about the numbers. Look, right now, you and I pay a state income tax of 5.19%. Also, corporations pay that. Here's what that means in real dollars. Pulling up the 2026 state budget, that's the one that kicks in July 1st, the governor's office estimates that $15.7 billion will come in from individual income taxes and $3.3 billion from corporations. That's $19 billion. Now, remember that number, $19 billion. The state budget, the part that's funded by state tax dollars and fees, that's $37 billion. Those two tax streams, Sam, that's more than 50% of the state budget. So that brings us to an interesting moment that happened during this year's legislative session when we got an updated copy of the 2026 state budget. This is Republican State Senator Blake Tillery, who more importantly is the chairman of the State Senate Appropriations Committee.
Last year, we actually passed legislation that required all tax credits and tax exemptions be included in the budget for planning purposes and also informational purposes, so that legislators, when they're making decisions based on taxpayer dollars, they understand how much revenue may be foregone because of special interest tax exemptions or special interest tax credits that we've already passed.
Now, instead of putting that whole document in the state budget, he ended up putting the top 11 credits and exemptions in the state budget. And at the top of that list, the state of Georgia forgoes $12.7 billion in sales tax revenue by not taxing services.
So if a plumber comes to your house in Georgia, you don't get a sales tax bill for his labor or her labor. Same thing for attorneys, doctors, and electricians. We can continue to reduce our income tax, rolling it back 0.1% at a time, which is what we've done. I think Governor Kemp's committed to doing that. The state legislature's committed to doing that. I'm committed to doing that. If we want to make bigger jumps, though, what other states have done is they spread that tax burden wider by taxing services and then reduce the income tax on or reduce the tax on income.
So if Georgia and Georgians want to be like other states without a state income tax, like Florida, like Tennessee, like Texas, this is one of the things lawmakers are going to have to look at. Some of the other interesting things on that top list of 11, the standard deduction on state income taxes. There's no sales taxes on prescription drugs or lottery tickets. And of course, we've done a lot of talking about the film tax credit. Those four put together, that's another $5 billion a year, Sam.
So talk to me about the politics of doing this.
You remember the number of people and lobbyists who were at the state capitol for tort reform? Think of the number of industries who are going to want an exemption. Think of healthcare, for example, sales taxes on your doctor copays or prescription drugs. As for where Tillery falls on all of this, Sam, he tells me that he wants to lower taxes overall, like the state has been doing. But for now, he's not committing to eliminating state income taxes. He would like to see some of these tax exemptions and tax credits ended, though. And I should mention that Tillery may be joining Gooch in that run for lieutenant governor.
All right, so as we look to 2026, Rahul, you've been following the saga of a party that, as of now, will not be on Georgia's ballot. Fill us in.
So Georgia Libertarians are working to regain ballot access for the 2026 midterm elections, which include, as we've been talking about, the open governor's seat and the U.S. Senate seat held by Democrat Jon Ossoff. Libertarians lost automatic ballot access in Georgia because of the 2024 presidential election results in Georgia. Chase Oliver is a member of the Libertarian Party of Georgia's executive committee, but is better known as the National Party's nominee for U.S. president in 2024. He explains what happened.
So because of the nature of the PSC races being changed and the fact that we hadn't had a PSC candidate or a race for that matter in the last election cycle, we were left with only the presidential race to determine the number we needed for ballot access, which has not traditionally been the case. And so because of that, we did lose ballot access because we didn't have that other statewide race that typically garners a higher vote total for us. And so now we are engaged in petitioning across the state to make sure that Georgians have more than two choices on their statewide ballot, at least in the 2026 cycle.
The Georgia Secretary of State's office says based on state law of reaching 1% of active 2024 general election voters, Georgia Libertarians would need to collect nearly 73,000 signatures by July of 2026. That's next year. By Georgia law, none of this can be done online. It has to be done in person.
Our goal is to make sure we have 100,000 verified signatures, which takes us well above the threshold we need because we know sometimes signatures do get tossed out.
Libertarians appearing on the ballot have played an important role in Georgia politics because candidates need to get at least 50% of the vote. Otherwise, the top two candidates go to a runoff. A perfect example, November 2020, when then U.S. Senator David Perdue, he received more votes than his Democratic challenger Jon Ossoff, but both had to go to a runoff because neither got 50% of the vote. Libertarian Shane Hazel got 2%. Ossoff then went on to defeat Perdue in the January 2021 runoff.
Well, let me raise one more topic as we look ahead to 2026, and that's some updates with the Georgia State Election Board and the Fulton County Election Board.
Man, Sam, we have not heard those. That's a throwback. They were, I feel like, perennial topics on this show when we followed the twists and turns for both of those bodies, and they all got national attention.
Totally. So let's start with Fulton County. This week, the Fulton County Commission declined to sign off on two controversial Republican nominees for the Fulton County Election Board. Now, the county GOP and Democratic parties each nominate two members to serve on this election board. The Fulton GOP put forward Julie Adams and Jason Frazier. And now these names may sound kind of familiar to you. Adams is a current member who sued her own board for the right to vote against certifying election results. And that sparked a showdown in court ahead of the 2024 election. Frazier has helped lead the effort to challenge the eligibility of thousands of Fulton County voters. Both have promoted false claims about widespread election fraud, and that's one reason Democratic Commissioner Mo Ivory joined the four other Democrats to quash the nominations.
It is, of course, possible to work with the GOP. We do in all of the appointments that we make. It's not possible to work with folks that are trying to sow chaos.
But Republican Commissioner Bridget Thorne said the body had a duty to approve the nominees.
If you want trust in our elections, we have to have a board that reflects the wishes of both parties, or else we're in a tyranny.
Julie Adams will hold her seat for now, along with the currently serving GOP member, until the commission can consider alternative nominees. But a legal challenge is also possible here. The commission did unanimously approve the 2 Democratic nominees, and these members will serve through the midterms and into 2027.
So Julie Adams attempted not to certify some election results, and that spurred some of the Trump-backed members of the state election board to pass rules that would have allowed that. The rules were ultimately blocked by the courts, but moving over to that board, that drama has sparked changes of how the SEB considers those rule changes, right, Sam?
So now the state election board will appoint a 10-member committee to vet and workshop proposed rule changes before they come in front of the board. Nonpartisan chair John Verveer says he wants a mix of citizens, lawyers, election officials, and even some lawmakers to sit on this committee. And this all comes after, as you alluded to there, the board has come under fire for this series of last-minute changes that were passed last year by the Republican members who had drawn praise from President Donald Trump on the campaign trail. The rules included a hand count of the number of ballots and giving local boards leeway to not certify election results. As you mentioned, the changes were blocked by the courts, and they're now under review by the Georgia Supreme Court. An effort in the legislature to take up some of these changes and put them into Georgia law was not successful this past session, but the Georgia House is convening a study committee to take a broad look at Georgia elections, and so some of these proposals could come back in the next legislative session.
Before we go, we're coming up on Memorial Day weekend, and I wanted to talk about some messy developments involving Washington and 2 popular spots in the Atlanta area. It started with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers announcing that a number of parks that they operate are going to be closed into the holiday weekend because of staffing shortages, most notably Lake Allatoona and, more importantly, Lake Lanier.
Yeah, Memorial Day is the unofficial kickoff to summer. These places are very popular for boating and picnicking, and I think this is something people are going to notice.
Yeah, Democratic U.S. Senator John Ossoff put out a statement blaming, quote, the administration's reckless and chaotic mismanagement. Republican Congressman Rich McCormick, whose district includes parts of Lake Lanier, he blamed the closure of 21 beaches and docks on Democrats for not passing a piece of legislation with an amendment he claims would have prevented the closures. Then late Wednesday, McCormick tweeted saying he had spoken to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and that the boat ramps would remain open and that only 11 recreation areas would remain closed, not 21. Still, I expect more finger pointing throughout this weekend.
That's it for this edition of Plugged In from WABE.
Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
Plugged In is available wherever you want to listen. If you listen on demand, make sure to head on over to the dedicated Plugged In feed to subscribe and leave us a rating.
And you can also now find us on the radio at 90.1 every Friday morning from 9:30 to 10.
And remember, as public media faces an uncertain funding stream, you can support this work with a gift at wabe.org/donate. I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali. We'll be back next week.